This story is shared by Evelyn Hart. They always told us that a house full of kin is the safest kind of shelter, a nest warmed by parents, a crib of comfort where a child can grow without fear. I learned early that the words adults teach children can be lies dressed in nicer clothes. My name is Evelyn Hart, though most folks now call me Miss Evelyn. I was born in 1952 in a small town called Hollowbridge, Alabama, a place with one stoplight and a long road that smelled of honeysuckle in the summer. If you picture a childhood full of picket fences and porch swings, then you have the half that everyone saw. The other half lived behind closed doors and in the hush of rooms where the truth got squeezed into small shapes. When I tell this story on the Stories Untold channel, I am not out for shock. I tell it because there are girls listening who think they are alone, and there are neighbors who prefer the tidy myth. I tell it because secrets rot. If you watch till the end, please tap like, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Sometimes the quiet connection of a name and a place can salvage someone's courage. I'll leave a few resource links in the description for anyone who needs help. I grew up in a two-room house that smelled like starch and tobacco. My father, William Hart, worked at the mill and came home smelling like oil, his shirt buttoned crooked, his breath heavy with whiskey. He was a man with hands that could overhaul an engine and a voice that could quiet a crowd. My mother, Rose, was slim and soft with a shawl around her shoulders and soup usually on the stove. There was another child, my older brother Samuel, Sam to everyone who liked him on the corner step. In the early years, Sam taught me to climb the magnolia tree and how to fish at the creek. He read comic books and made paper boats. I thought we were like all siblings, trading laughter for mischief. Then things shifted in places where only eyes can witness. At first, it was as small as a hand that lingered when it pretended to tuck hair behind my ear. Then it was a look that turned warm into hungry. I was a child trying to understand the difference. When I was 7, I remember one afternoon after church, hymnals had been put away, Sam cornering me in the pantry while Mama hummed in the kitchen. He said, "You're mine, Evie. You hear me? You're mine." He said it like a prize meant to be kept rather than a person who breathed. I went straight to my mother. Her hands were in suds, her face wet with the day's steam. And when I said Sam was strange, she did what mothers of that time did best. She minimized it. "He's just being affectionate," she told me, worried and tired and small. It was easier to believe Mom's explanation than to stand against a tide that included my father's roar and my brother's easy charm. So I learned to fold my fear away into small parcels I could carry alone. The nights grew worse. In the dark, I would feel the bed dip as if an invisible weight had taken the other side. A hand would stray down a back and linger. The first time it became more than frightening, it became a prison. The morning after, when my body hurt and my soul hollowed out from the inside. Mama suspected, I think. There were nights she'd find Sam at the foot of my bed and say nothing. "You two are close," Daddy would say with a smile when he saw the scene, pride tilting his voice. That praise was a blanket over poison. I learned then a rule no child should know. When your family turns a blind eye, your safety belongs to your own small cunning. I stopped dancing in the yard. I wore my hair pinned tight, but quiet is a dangerous companion. It allowed what should have been punished to continue. At 11, the line that separated childhood from something else snapped. On my birthday, Sam hugged me too long in front of the table, and later that night he told me I needed to learn grown-up things. I tried to cry, but his hand closed over my mouth. After that, mornings were ache and silence, and I learned quickly how to pretend. Mama noticed my limp more and the way I ate less, but she turned away with practiced hands. "We mustn't make trouble," she whispered once, wrapping dishcloths around her fingers. Father's pride in Sam grew louder. "That's my boy," he would say, patting Sam like a badge. To the neighbors, we were respectable. To myself, I was shrinking into the narrowest shape I could find. I started to measure out my life in tiny accommodations. Which stairs to use at night, where to lock a drawer, and how to smile with the correct amount of gratitude so that no one looked too closely. I kept counting the days. The first time I knew there would be consequences was the morning I woke dizzy and sick, a misstep into a truth no child is taught to carry. At 14, the idea that your body might betray you was more than frightening. It was dangerous. There were no books for me, no talks. Hollowbridge taught girls to stay quiet and to be grateful. When I told Mama, she folded inward, hands busy at the sink. "We will manage," she whispered, and her voice sounded as if it had been softened by long years of practice. I learned to hide a body that wanted to be seen. Wide skirts, loose sweaters, shawls wrapped tight even in heat. Sam pretended not to notice. Daddy noticed and found an answer that fit him: blame. He wanted an enemy he could name without looking at his own son. So the town whispered, and we wove a story about a stranger, a name that would make it simpler for everyone who needed neatness over truth. As the months went on, the town's pity arrived in whispers and in the tilted sympathy of the church ladies. I went to Mass with a shawl over my belly, and no one touched my hand. Mama, who had midwifed for neighbors, prepared as best she could: warm water, boiled herbs, strips of cloth. The day the baby came, there was no clinic to run to. My labor lasted hours. I bit a rag to keep from shouting that this was not a choice but a theft. When the baby was born, a boy with dark hair and wide eyes, I felt something impossible, a stubborn, overwhelming tenderness. I named him Daniel because it felt like a name that could hold the fierce thing he was, both innocence and survival. For a moment, wrapped in that small body, the fury and sorrow fell away, if only for the length of a breath. The house, however, refused mercy. Father, furious and embarrassed, needed a villain. He chose one whose life would be uprooted so that the family's honor could appear intact. My name, once called with affection, became a hush and a pointed finger. I became the scandal to be managed. The world we lived in was very small, and that made rumors travel like wildfire. Men said what they wanted. Women crossed the street to show distance. At school, teachers looked at me as if I were a problem to file away. The neighbor who had once sent me cookies stopped at our gate. Sam kept his distance in public and returned at night. His touch continued sometimes, less frequent perhaps, but the damage had been done. I learned who would stand with me and who would not. Mrs. Linton, the mayor's wife, was one of those who would watch without pretending ignorance. She would later become a hand on the rope that pulled us toward escape, but in those months the world felt like an equation with no solution. Father's outrage was a performance. He marched down to the general store and spoke of honor as if it were a ledger he could balance with accusations. A young man who worked at the gas station found himself named in my father's mouth. By evening, the boy's family packed and left town under a cloud of shame they had not earned. I watched the doorway while they carried a trunk past our gate, and understood how quickly a life could be ruined for convenience. Sam put on the mask the world rewarded him with: fine manners and a steady jaw. As the months advanced, the house became rules designed to keep me small. No school trips, no visits, no laughter that lasted. Mama stitched and hummed and tried to soften my days. She made poultices for my aching back and sang low songs while I rested. We made plans in whispers. By then Daniel was active under my ribs, a presence that knotted sorrow and tenderness together into something fierce. I made 2 clumsy attempts to leave. The first time I walked to the lane with a single bag, Daniel wrapped close, thinking the horizon might be kinder. Sam found me and dragged me back, and Daddy beat me until I passed out. The second attempt ended at the creek when a dog alerted a neighbor. I was pulled back and punished until my knees bled. Each failure tightened the locks that were already there. Yet help came to us quietly. Mrs. Linton, the mayor's wife, left loaves at the gate and coins in a saucer. Rosie, a brash young woman who kept her life lighter than most, began to appear with practical notes. Bus times, a contact in Atlanta, a woman who rented rooms to working mothers. They did not demand explanations. They offered a map that I would later follow. It felt foolish to hope. Hope is stubborn. I hid their counsel in my dress lining, counting small coins each night. Folded bills a tiny step toward the life Daniel deserved, and the door I would find. The night we left Hollowbridge was the kind of small betrayal that felt like heaven. Mrs. Linton, with her steady hands and a cover story rehearsed like a hymn, had arranged the ticket and a letter to a woman in Atlanta who ran a modest boarding house for working women. Rosie accompanied us to the station, hugging Daniel and whispering last-minute directions. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might break free and race after the bus. I remember stepping on the stairs and feeling my feet wobble with equal parts terror and the sense that a door had finally been opened. The bus smelled of oil and stale coffee. Daniel fell asleep against my shoulder almost immediately, thumb in his mouth, trusting as a newborn to the movement of the road. I watched the fields blur by in the pale light. Hollowbridge disappeared under a ribbon of night, and with it a part of myself I was still mourning. There was fear, too. Men like Sam don't forgive easily. I kept my bag close to my chest, and when we reached Atlanta, tall buildings made me dizzy with their sheer size. The boarding house was clean and quiet, run by a woman named Mrs. Harwell who expected work in exchange for board. I scrubbed pans, tended stoves, and learned quickly the rhythm of the kitchen. People here were hurried but kinder in the small, practical ways that matter. A bandage wrapped without questions, a bite of cornbread slipped between hands, a wink that said we understood without needing a story. I took the name Evelyn Moore when I filled out the registry. A new name felt like armor for nights I didn't yet know how to survive. At the boarding house, Daniel grew. He was a bright boy who laughed often, who learned to love other children at the neighborhood lot. Mrs. Harwell kept a small crib for him in the back kitchen when I worked early shifts. The first months were a blur of change. I learned to count money, to bargain at the market, and to find the cheapest bus fare for the rare times I let myself call Hollowbridge with a number Mrs. Linton had left me. The calls were short and brittle. My mother's voice sounded smaller over the distance. My days at the stove made me into someone practical, the woman who could flip eggs with a single hand and cut a roast with a practiced wrist. The nights were for Daniel, for stories I made up about fathers who were heroes at work and died in some far-off accident, a safe lie I used to keep his childhood free of my own horrors. He believed it because he was young, and the world benefits from small, steadfast myths. I breastfed him as long as I could. Later, the boarding house women helped with bottles when long shifts made nursing impossible. One afternoon, a man named Arthur Bennett came to the boarding house. He was in his 60s, a retired clerk now with a small retirement and a taste for quiet company. He noticed Daniel immediately, as if the boy radiated something he'd been missing. Arthur was different from the men I'd known. He didn't leer or make jokes that felt like traps. He fixed a leaky faucet at the house, brought a book to Daniel, and once offered to watch the boy while I finished a double shift. His patience was a gentle thing, a rhythm that did not demand anything I was not ready to give. We grew into a strange family. Arthur had lost his wife years before, and somehow, in the steady, honest rhythm of our days, there was space for mutual care without gossip. He read to Daniel every week and taught him how to fix bicycles, to look at engines without fear. I watched them and felt a relief I had not known was possible. Arthur offered me a chance to move out of the boarding house, keep his house, cook for him, and he would pay a fair wage. It was not charity, it was partnership by another name. I said yes, of course. The house Arthur offered was a small place in an older district, with a yard where Daniel could chase pigeons and a porch where I could sit in the dusk and imagine a life where the worst days were behind us. He had no children nearby, and his own family rarely called, so perhaps we filled a silence he didn't know he had. I kept my old name in odd corners, a reminder that despite the new surname, the truth lived inside me like an unsilenced bell. Time passed with small victories. I found steady hours at the diner, neighbors learned Daniel's name, and teachers praised his curious mind. I saved coins in a jar, paid bills, and planted a small garden where tomatoes grew. Still, sometimes at night I woke in panic that Sam might find us. I kept a list in a drawer, always. Arthur Bennett's presence steadied us for years. He fell ill in his 60s, heart misbehaving like an old engine that refused a tune-up, and I became his nurse with a careful rhythm. We helped the doctor with pills and warm compresses, sat with him through worrying nights, and held his hand while the crowd outside the hospital corridor waited for news. He joked that I was a better nurse than any trainee he'd seen, and when he grew fragile he asked, in a voice that was more a sanded whisper than a command, that Daniel and I be taken care of if anything happened. I did not know how to refuse. When he told me he wanted Daniel and me to keep the house if anything happened, I thought at first it was a delusion of a man who had lost his sleep. He was firm. "You and that boy are family," he said. "Keep it. Keep living." He fiddled with a paper and told me the lawyer was a man who liked tidy paperwork. I protested. How could I accept such bounty? But he insisted. When he died in late summer, the funeral was a small affair, and his children came to collect their part. There were murmurs. They asked questions. Some of them tried to make the arrangement sound like a mistake. The lawyer smiled and reminded them of the signed will. It felt surreal at first, entering rooms that had never been mine with a set of keys in my hand. I painted the kitchen in a cheerful blue and bought Daniel a proper bed of his own. For the first time I could call the plumber and fix the heater without embarrassment. I kept working, but with something like security beneath my feet for the first time in decades. Daniel started school with a full belly and a clean uniform, and he thrived. He learned to read early, devoured books about bridges and machines, and loved the way the engine of things worked. As the years unfurled, my life settled into a pattern of work, school events, and quiet community involvement. I never told Daniel the truth about his father. I invented a hero who had died in an accident. It was a protective lie that shaped his identity and gave him something to admire. He grew into a decent man, polite, curious, patient. I worried about the green in his eyes sometimes, a trait that reminded me of Sam, but I learned to separate ancestry from action. Daniel chose kindness again and again. Nurture can reroute a lineage. By the time he was a teenager, I had stitched together a modest savings, and he earned a scholarship to a local university to study engineering. The night he packed his trunk for college, neighbors came with casseroles and blessings, and I watched him stand tall in the doorway. He promised to write, and he did. The letters he sent home were full of plans and diagrams and the kind of exuberant hope that had once felt like a fantasy. I paid his tuition by working extra nights at the diner and by doing small repair jobs for neighbors. It was a hard life, but it felt honest. There were times when the past knifed my calm. I would wake in the dark and hear a laugh that could have been Sam's. I checked doors and counted days since that small town had become a memory. But the laughter faded as Daniel filled our house with music and study and friends. He became a young man who built bridges and not barriers. When he graduated at the top of his class, I could barely catch my breath. His diploma felt like proof that something small and perfect had emerged from the dust of horror. Years taught me to hold joy beside memory. Daniel married Claire, a bright woman who welcomed me into their plans without asking questions. Their wedding was small, church bells, a potluck, neighbors clapping. And when their first child came, I held a tiny hand and felt the old dark recede a bit. Grandchildren changed the mathematics of grief. Suddenly there were reasons to plant tomatoes and to tell silly stories at bedtime. I kept a battered notebook and wrote at night, not for Daniel, but to keep details from fraying. Writing made memory legible and fear manageable. We exchanged recipes and errands with neighbors. Small solidarities mended things in ways I had not expected. I volunteered at the school, cooked for church sales, and learned how small acts stitch a neighborhood. I called myself a widow when people asked, a lie that protected my boy and eventually felt easier to carry. Now, in my 70s, I tend the garden and watch grandchildren grow. I am thankful for the battered kindness that made a life for us, and breathe deeply. Now, recording this on the Stories Untold channel, I sit with a mug cooling beside me and a garden sun slanting across my porch. Why tell this now? Because time has thinned the fear and thickened the urgency. There are girls in county towns and in city apartments who carry terrible burdens alone. If my voice, hoarse and aged, helps one of them lift a finger to a phone or to reach for a neighbor's hand, then the telling is worth it. I'm not telling you for pity. I'm telling you because secrecy breeds monsters, and because the brave little acts of sharing can become lifelines. When I think about the girl I was, I remember the small moments, the songs my mother hummed, the crispness of autumn mornings, the ache of hunger. But I also remember the warmth of Mrs. Linton's bread, the quick hands of Rosie, the patient work of Arthur. People were both cruel and merciful. Life was messy, and the parts that were kind saved us more times than I can count. I say this so you understand. Survival isn't a thing you do alone. It takes a dozen small mercies, a map made of favors, and a stubborn refusal to stop trying. I kept Daniel's paternity secret because I chose his happiness and safety over my need for truth. I lied by omission, and for decades the lie protected him. He believed in a man who never existed, a narrative I fed him, because the truth could have shunted him into prisons of shame and confusion that would have followed him his whole life. It was a decision that sits heavy with me, but also one I understand as an act of motherly armor. I have thought often about whether I had the right to withhold it. Sometimes I think the right choice is not a single moral act, but a series of smaller choices you make every day. You might wonder if hiding it changed him. He grew into a man of honesty and compassion. He married a good woman, became a father, and taught his children to be decent humans. The green glance that sometimes startled me, a small genetic echo, never became a forerunner of cruelty. Nurture can change a pattern. Love can reroute a terrible inheritance. As for Sam, he faded into the geography of my memory. Rumors of his misdeeds drifted to other towns, and his name became a cautionary tale. I do not know where he is now. I do not seek him. I prefer to keep my attention on the family that persisted through the worst. Starting the Stories Untold channel was a small, stubborn thing. Claire helped me set up a camera and taught me to speak into a little box that would carry my voice farther than my porch ever could. The first videos were about recipes and small memories. Later I told pieces of my life. Comments arrived, quiet thanks, shared memories, messages that said, "I left because of you." That surprised me. It proved that a single voice can loosen chains for others. My days are quieter now. I tend the garden, I sit on the porch and read letters from viewers, and I take calls from people who want to share their stories. Sometimes they write from rooms that are still dark. Sometimes they write with the bright, fierce light of someone who has escaped. Each message is a kind of miracle. I do not pretend I am fixed. I only say that survival is possible and that community matters more than pride. Before we close, please remember, if you are trapped, reach out. There are shelters and hotlines that can help with safety plans and housing. If you can, tell me where you're from in the comments. Like the video to help others find it, and subscribe so we can keep gathering these stories. Sharing widens another's path. My name is Evelyn Hart. I chose to protect my son and to give him a life, and I stand by that choice. But now I tell this story because the world needs to know secrets do not have to have the final word. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other. Always. Recording this feels like folding a letter I'm sending to a world I did not always trust. There is a strange courage in speaking about what once felt unspeakable. The voice that tells this story now is older and steadier, softened by years and the small mercies of neighbors and unexpected friends. I am not the same scared girl on the pantry floor. Pain taught me cunning and endurance, but it also taught me where to find those who offered help without spectacle. You may be wondering whether keeping the secret was cruel to Daniel. I admit the moral ambivalence of that choice has kept me up many nights. But when I think about the outcome, a son who built bridges instead of walls, who loved deeply and became a father who reads to his child, I believe the protection worked as intended. A mother must weigh the lives of her children against her desire for confession. For me, silence was an act of preservation rather than surrender. There are things I would change if I could. I wish Mama had been stronger for herself. I wish a neighbor had spoken up sooner. I wish laws had been kinder to women who are trapped by fear and poverty. But we live in the sum of what people did and what they did not. With time, I found my agency not in the noise of accusation but in the quiet of rebuilding. I learned to plant tomatoes as if planting the future and to teach my grandchildren about dignity. If you are watching and your fingers tremble, know this: you are not alone. There are organizations that specialize in helping people leave abusive homes. You can plan, save, and move when it is safe. You can talk to a friend and ask for shelter or call a hotline. There are lawyers who will help you seek protection orders. There are doctors who will treat physical injuries and counselors who will help stitch the pieces back together. I put numbers and links in the description below for those who need them. If you are in immediate danger, please contact your local emergency services. If you want to help a neighbor, be practical and discreet. Offer rides, a phone, or a small envelope of cash when you can. Don't force confessions. Listen and believe. Keep emergency numbers handy and know the shelters in your area. Quiet, consistent help often matters more than grand gestures. If you can, assist with logistics, a temporary address, a trusted friend to hold documents, or a contact who will take a child for a few hours. Safety planning is work, and it often requires a small network of steady hands. Recovery is not a single moment. It is the accumulation of little acts. A morning cup of coffee made in calm, a clean pair of sheets, a child's laugh that is free of fear. These small pleasures rebuild the muscle of trust. I took up bird feeding in my yard and found a peculiar solace watching them return each day. They taught me the economy of resilience: prepare, gather, and move with a quiet insistence. Finally, every life deserves to be told on its own terms. I have told you mine not as a lecture but as a company of one telling another. I survived. We survived. If a single person watching chooses to call a hotline, to buy a bus ticket, or to knock on a neighbor's door, then these words will have done their work. Share this video if you think it might help someone. Leave a like to help the algorithm nudging these stories into new places. And subscribe to Stories Untold to keep the chain of witness alive. My name is Evelyn Hart. I kept this weight for many decades. I chose to protect my son and to give him a life, and I would choose that again. But now I speak so others might see a door they didn't know existed. I will keep telling these stories while I still have breath. Peace be with you. Be brave for yourself and brave for the ones you love.